let's talk about anti-torque systems. Now, because the helicopter has a big rotor, which is spinning counterclockwise in a standard helicopter, as viewed from above, the helicopter itself wants to turn clockwise. So there is a torque that's going to try to turn it. Now, in order to compensate for that, there's a couple of ways you can go. Of course, the most common way is to use a tail rotor. So here's the tail rotor system on a Schweitzer, and you'll notice that it's on the left so that it can push the tail to the right, which pushes the nose to the left. And we say that the left pedal is your power pedal. So if I push the left pedal, it increases the pitch here. And if I push the right pedal, it pitches it the other way. And we have talked about the fact that you'll notice that it does do a lot more pitch toward the left than toward the right. And that's because, honestly, the only reason that we even have the ability to put in right pedal is for auto rotations. And also, you might say, well, otherwise you couldn't make a right turn on the ground. It's not really required that you make a right turn on the ground. I suppose it's convenient, though. So that is a traditional tail rotor. There are other kinds of tail rotor systems as well. Okay, so what are some alternative tail rotor systems? One of them is called the Fenstron. It's basically the same thing as a normal tail rotor. It's just contained inside of a shroud. And why do people like that? Especially things like medical helicopters. It's a little bit better protection from people trying to walk into the thing. It's harder. It's not impossible to get yourself into one of those and hurt yourself, but it's just a little bit harder. And that's one reason why people like them. There is another alternative anti-torque system out there. It's called the Rotor system, for no tail rotor. And how does that work? Now, first of all, why would you want that? Well, there's a couple of reasons why you might want that. It takes a lot of power to drive the tail rotor. You're sucking 20 to 30% of the power that could have gone to your main rotor just to run the tail rotor. So obviously that's a big reduction. So how does this work? You have the main rotor wake that comes down into the system. So you have the tail rotor, and it has air that's going to be coming in through this intake, and it's going to be shoved down the tail, and then we're going to have this nozzle here that's going to jet. So essentially, this jetted airflow acts somewhat like a tail rotor, a traditional tail rotor. It's going to provide thrust. Now, what's going on up here? We have this thing called the Konoda Effect. So how does that work? This is providing the majority of what's going on here. So we have the air that flows around, and there's a little side view here. So we have this downwash, and we have this air jet. So if you will, it's kind of leaking a little bit of this air, and that essentially makes an airfoil. So now I have this airfoil, and this distance is bigger than this distance, and we talked about how that works before. So it creates lift. So it's going to push the tail to the right, which is what we wanted. So we don't have to put in so much left pedal. So this is the Rotor system, originally developed so that there wouldn't be choppy things in the back, and also in hopes that it would be more efficient. Of course, the reality is it wasn't quite as good as they hoped. But there are some helicopters out there that feature the system. Now, one thing you should be aware of is that if you have such a system and you have an engine failure, then it's going to fly a little bit differently than some other helicopters when you're doing things like an auto rotation. It still works, it's just going to be a little bit different. Now, you might argue with me and say, but this is mostly found on a turbine helicopter, so the turbine engines are much more reliable, which is true. So you're much less likely to have to, do an auto rotation in such a helicopter.